Hi, I'm Susan Grunewald, and I'm going to talk to you today about GIS digital mapping. I'm going to start by showing you how I've used it in my own research, and then I'll talk to you about how you too can get started in digital mapping. So my research looks at German prisoners of war in the Soviet Union during and after World War II. The Soviets held on to about 1.5 million men after the end of the Second World War, and they held on to them until 1956, which was 11 years longer, which was 11 years after the end of the war, and was 7 years longer than any of the other Allied victor nations held on to their POWs. The real central question to my research is why did they hold on to them for so long? And I have argued that it is for economic reasons related to the destruction of the Second World War. The Soviet Union lost 27 million citizens during the war. 2 of the 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust were murdered on Soviet soil, and the nation lost about a quarter of its total physical assets. So Soviet authorities chose to hold on to any able-bodied POWs to assist in reconstruction. Much of my mapping work, which I'll show you in a few minutes, is based off of a source that was a list of the roughly 4,000 camps that operated across the entire Soviet Union. I took this print book and did a process called optical character recognition, or OCR. So I scanned all of the pages, and then I went through and used software to turn the pictures of the scans back into text. I ran into a few problems with this. One is that the source book was in German, and two, if you'll notice, the source book is in tabular format. OCR works much better with paragraph form as opposed to tabular format. So I ended up using 2 different softwares. One is Abby FineReader, and the other was the open source program called Tabula, which is web-based and specifically works for things in tabular format, as the name denotes. The end result was that I had 2 spreadsheets that were somewhat broken, and I combined the 2 and then cleaned them to produce the maps that I'm going to show you. And so you can see sort of how it's looked in its clean form. And so I've created a series of maps that show all the camps that operated in the Soviet Union. I initially worked with a programmer to use R, the programming language R, and RStudio, and as you'll see on the map, there are some problems with the automatic location of these sources, geolocation of these sources. I could not do 4,000 camps by hand, right? You can ask Google Maps for latitude and longitude coordinates, but I needed a computer automated process to scale up and do this many of them. But the initial searching with R ran into these problems. As you should see, there shouldn't be camps in Africa or the United States, for example. I then worked with a programmer to write a script with Python, and we wrote some special things into the script like Google Maps, please only return to us locations that have country codes of the countries that were in the Soviet Union, and only places that are in the bounds of the Soviet Union. And if you can't find it, write something into the spreadsheet that says you couldn't find it. So then I had the second series of maps, which again are more refined, still some issues, but it was easier to go back and hand correct some of these problems and realize problems with the transliteration with fewer errors. And this is an example of how the automatic geolocating was asked to tell me if there was a problem with what it could or could not find. Now, GIS is great. Geographic information systems are great for making historical arguments, especially when you use multiple sources of data, right? So in addition to plotting where the camps physically were in the Soviet Union, I was able to plot them in comparison to natural resources and infrastructure such as railways. So the map that you see right now shows all the camps that operated from 41 to 56 in relation to the Russian railroad system and coal basin data. So there's a correlation between camp location and, say, the fighting of the Second World War. So if you'll notice, most of the camps are clustered around European Russia and the European republics, such as Ukraine, Latvia, Estonia, etc. These are the places that saw the most active fighting of the war. There are also clusterings of camps in locations such as the Ural Mountain Range, which was a center of Soviet steelmaking and industry, and where much of Soviet industry was evacuated to during the German advance into the main territory of European Russia in the early years of the war. There's also a correlation between the camp locations and coal basins. So I was able to make assertions in my research about the relationship between POW forced labor and the Soviet economy and the reconstruction of the Soviet economy. POWs in the mapping, it shows that they were involved in key resource production and the industries that were most needed to rebuild the country after war. I was also able to map the camps in relation to the average January temperature data for Russia. So despite the fact that many of the POWs stated that they had been in Siberia, the mapping shows that the majority of them were not indeed in Siberia, and for those ones who were in Siberia, they were in the more temperate regions of Siberia. I was also able to do a time analysis. So I was able to trace the opening and closing of the camps in relation to the war, and then the closing of the camps as post-war reconstruction continued. Roughly by 1949, the POWs ceased to be used more so for economic reasons and became political bargaining chips in the developing Cold War. The mapping shows this because by 1949, the majority of the camps, especially in industrial centers, had closed down, and the remaining few were used mostly for political re-education. So moving on to spatial questions and digital literacy. If you want to do a research project of this nature, what and how can you learn these things? I did my mapping with the professional software ArcGIS. ArcGIS is the preeminent mapping software. However, the drawback is that it is very expensive. If your institution does not have a license, it can cost thousands and thousands of dollars to use this software. There's the open source QGIS, which does much of the same mapping work. Many of the same analysis features, what have you, can use the same sorts of data. But I happened to just get started in ArcGIS because my school had a license, and I took a course in ArcGIS at my school. Both ArcGIS, Esri, who makes ArcGIS, and then QGIS, there's plenty of information on the internet for you to learn how to do it yourself through videos or tutorials. If you're looking for more formal instruction on a shorter basis that's not available at your university potentially, you can go to summer intensives like the Digital Humanities Summer Institute or courses taught by HILT. The Programming Historian has a great series for getting started with QGIS and some of the different things that you can do with QGIS, especially for those of you out there who are historians and who would wish to do something in which you scan historical maps and then overlay data on top of it. You'll also see in the links to this video, there's a great two-part blog series on getting started in mapping with QGIS. It's created by a man named Seth Bernstein. One is just about getting and cleaning the data, and then his second part is about mapping and analyzing the data. So if you want to go from A to B, download, get, use, clean, and then map, and then analyze through the mapping software with QGIS, I highly recommend this tutorial. There are a lot of data sources out there as well. Start looking with data sources and see what ones could be good for your research project. I like the highly formal dragons8mycat.com/GIS data sources. This is a list of all the free open source data sources that you can get on the internet by country, right? A to Z, look up your country and go from there. Thank you very much, and if you have any other questions about getting started with GIS and mapping, please do not hesitate to reach out and contact me.